August 14, 1945. In a makeshift prison camp on a remote Philippine island, dozens of Japanese women huddled together in the darkness, their bodies trembling not from cold, but from absolute terror. They had heard the news. The war was over. Japan had surrendered, and now they believed their final hour had come. These women, captured during the chaotic retreat of Japanese forces, had been taught since childhood that American soldiers were monsters who showed no mercy to prisoners. Tonight, they prayed for a quick death. But when dawn broke, the guards didn't arrive with rifles. They came with something far more unexpected: hot coffee, fresh bread, and smiles. This is the true story of the morning that shattered years of propaganda and replaced terror with tears of disbelief. This is the story of when the so-called monsters arrived and humanity prevailed over hatred. The Pacific War had been the most brutal conflict in modern history. From Pearl Harbor to Okinawa, the fighting between American and Japanese forces had been marked by ferocity, desperation, and deeply ingrained mutual hatred. Both sides had dehumanized the other through relentless propaganda. Japanese citizens were told that Americans were barbaric devils who tortured prisoners and violated women without hesitation. American soldiers, in turn, were taught that the Japanese were fanatical enemies who would never surrender and deserved no quarter. This toxic cycle of fear and hatred had cost millions of lives across the Pacific theater. For Japanese civilians and military personnel alike, capture by Allied forces was considered the ultimate shame. The concept of surrender went against every principle drilled into them by their government and military leadership. The Bushido Code, the way of the warrior, emphasized honor through death, rather than the disgrace of captivity. Japanese propaganda reinforced this belief by spreading stories of Allied atrocities against prisoners. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and military briefings consistently portrayed American and Allied soldiers as savage beasts who committed unspeakable acts against those they captured. These weren't just casual warnings. They were systematic psychological campaigns designed to ensure Japanese forces would fight to the death, rather than surrender. Women faced an even more terrifying narrative. Japanese propaganda specifically warned that American soldiers would assault, torture, and execute any Japanese women they encountered. Stories circulated of entire groups of women choosing mass suicide rather than face capture. On Saipan, in one of the war's most tragic episodes, hundreds of Japanese civilians, including women and children, leaped from cliffs to their deaths rather than surrender to advancing American forces. These women had been convinced that capture meant a fate worse than death. This belief was so deeply embedded that Japanese military officers sometimes distributed grenades to civilian women, encouraging them to take their own lives if capture became imminent. By August 1945, the war had reached its final desperate phase. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had forced Emperor Hirohito to make the unprecedented decision to surrender. For the first time in Japan's history, the nation had been defeated. News of the surrender spread rapidly through military units and prison camps across the Pacific. For Japanese prisoners of war, this announcement brought not relief, but absolute dread. If the war was over and Japan had lost, what would happen to them now? Would their captors, no longer needing to maintain any pretense of following international law, simply execute them all? In a prisoner of war camp on a small island in the Philippines, several dozen Japanese women faced this terrifying question. These women were not soldiers. Most were civilians who had been living in Japanese-occupied territories, working as nurses, teachers, or support staff for military operations. When American forces recaptured these territories, the women had been swept up in the chaos, separated from their families, and detained as prisoners. Some had been in captivity for weeks, others for months. All of them had been living in a state of constant fear, waiting for the day their captors would decide their lives no longer had value. Among these women was 23-year-old Akemi Nakamura. Before the war consumed everything, Akemi had been a schoolteacher in Tokyo, full of dreams about literature, travel, and a peaceful future. When the military mobilized civilian support, she had been assigned to work as a nurse's aide in the Philippines, helping care for wounded Japanese soldiers. She never imagined she would end up here, imprisoned behind barbed wire, wondering if she would live to see another sunrise. Akemi had always been strong, but now, as she sat in the darkness of the camp barracks, she felt that strength crumbling. She had watched other prisoners succumb to illness, malnutrition, and despair. How much longer could any of them endure? Sitting beside Akemi was Michiko Sato, a 45-year-old woman who had worked as a midwife before the war. Michiko had a grown son fighting somewhere in the Pacific, though she hadn't heard from him in over a year. She feared the worst but never spoke of it. In the camp, Michiko had become a mother figure to the younger women, offering comfort and trying to maintain some semblance of hope even when she felt none herself. But tonight, even Michiko's resolve was breaking. She had heard the whispers among the guards, seen the tension in their faces. Something was coming, and everyone knew it. The night of August 14th was the longest night of their lives. Word had spread through the camp that Emperor Hirohito had announced Japan's surrender over the radio. The women didn't need to hear the broadcast to know what it meant. The war was over, and they were on the losing side. In Japanese culture, defeat carried unbearable shame, but for prisoners, the implications went far beyond shame. They believed that with the war concluded, their captors would have no reason to keep them alive. Execution seemed inevitable. As darkness fell, the women gathered together in small groups, clutching each other's hands and whispering prayers. Some wrote farewell letters to families they would never see again, using scraps of paper and bits of charcoal. Others simply sat in silence, staring at the walls of their makeshift barracks, trying to prepare themselves for what they believed would come with the dawn. Akemi found herself thinking about her mother, her younger brother, her students back in Tokyo. Would they ever know what happened to her? Would anyone remember that she had existed at all? Michiko moved through the barracks, offering quiet words of comfort to the younger women, though her own heart was breaking. She held the hands of girls barely out of their teens, girls who should have been planning weddings and dreaming of children, not facing execution in a foreign land. What kind of world had they created, where such things were possible? Michiko had lived through so much, survived so many hardships, but this night felt like the end of everything. Some of the women prayed to Buddha, asking for mercy in the next life. Others wrote the names of their loved ones over and over as if inscribing them into memory one final time. A few women, unable to bear the waiting, broke down in tears, their sobs echoing through the barracks. But most remained silent, their faces masks of resignation and fear. They had been taught that to show weakness was shameful, but tonight, shame no longer mattered. They were going to die, and they knew it. The guards patrolling outside the barracks that night were young American soldiers, most of them barely older than the women they were guarding. These men had fought their way across the Pacific, island by island, witnessing horrors that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. They had lost friends, seen entire units decimated, and been trained to view the Japanese as an implacable enemy. But now, standing guard over these frightened women, some of them began to feel something unexpected, not hatred, not anger, but a profound sense of sadness at the human cost of this terrible war. Among the guards was Sergeant William Thompson, a 25-year-old farm boy from Iowa. Bill had enlisted right after Pearl Harbor, driven by patriotic fury and a desire to avenge the attack on his country. He had fought at Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Okinawa, seeing combat that had turned his hair prematurely gray and left scars both visible and invisible. Bill had killed enemy soldiers, had watched his buddies die, had learned to shut down his emotions just to survive. But tonight, listening to the muffled sounds of women crying in the barracks, something stirred in him that he thought the war had killed. Compassion. Bill wasn't alone in his feelings. Private Tommy Chen, a 22-year-old soldier of Japanese descent from California, felt the weight of this moment more than anyone. Tommy's family had been sent to an internment camp early in the war, their loyalty questioned simply because of their ancestry. Despite this injustice, Tommy had volunteered to serve in the military, determined to prove his patriotism. He had been assigned to work as a translator and liaison, using his Japanese language skills to help interrogate prisoners and communicate with civilians. But tonight, as he stood outside the barracks listening to prayers in his parents' native language, Tommy felt torn between two identities, two worlds that should never have been at war. Captain Daniel Carter, the 35-year-old officer in command of the camp, had spent the evening reviewing orders and contemplating the weight of his responsibilities. Carter had been a high school history teacher before the war, a man who believed in justice, fairness, and the rule of law. The war had tested those beliefs repeatedly, forcing him to make impossible choices and witness atrocities on both sides. But Carter had never lost sight of one fundamental principle. The enemy were human beings, not monsters. And now that the war was over, he had a chance to prove that principle meant something. As the night wore on, Captain Carter called his senior staff together in his office. The mood was somber. Everyone knew what the prisoners believed was going to happen. The question was, what were they actually going to do? Some of the soldiers suggested simply following standard protocol, processing the prisoners and waiting for further orders from higher command. Others, still angry over years of brutal combat, muttered that maybe the prisoners deserved to be afraid after everything Japan had done. But Carter silenced them with a single question. What kind of men are we going to be now that the fighting is over? The room fell silent. These men had spent years learning how to kill, how to survive, how to hate. Now suddenly they were being asked to remember how to show mercy. Carter looked around at his men, seeing the exhaustion and trauma etched into every face. He knew they had earned the right to be angry, to be bitter, to want revenge. But he also knew that this moment would define them far more than any battle. How they treated these prisoners now in victory would reveal their true character. Carter made his decision. Tomorrow morning, he told his men, they would show these women that the propaganda had been lies. They would demonstrate that Americans, even after years of war, could choose compassion over cruelty. They would prove that humanity could survive even the most brutal conflict. He ordered Sergeant Thompson and Private Chen to prepare a special breakfast for the prisoners, the best food they could manage with their limited supplies. Hot coffee, fresh bread, canned fruit, even some chocolate bars from their personal rations. It wasn't much, but it would be enough to send a message. You are not going to die today. You are going to live. Not all of Carter's men agreed with this decision. Some grumbled that it was a waste of resources, that these prisoners didn't deserve kindness. Others simply didn't understand why they should care about the comfort of enemy prisoners. But Carter's authority was absolute, and his orders were clear. By dawn, everything was prepared. The coffee was brewed, the bread was warm, and the soldiers, despite their reservations, stood ready to serve breakfast to women who expected execution. As the first light of dawn broke over the camp, the women in the barracks realized they were still alive. The night had passed without the sound of boots marching toward them, without orders to line up outside, without the click of rifles being loaded. For a moment, confusion mixed with their fear. Why hadn't it happened yet? Were they prolonging the inevitable, making them suffer longer? Akemi looked at Michiko, and in the older woman's eyes, she saw the same question reflected back. What were they waiting for? Then they heard it, the sound of the barracks door being unlocked. The women tensed, their bodies going rigid with terror. This was it. The moment had come. Some of them closed their eyes, whispering final prayers. Others stared straight ahead, determined to face death with whatever dignity they could muster. Michiko squeezed Akemi's hand so tightly it hurt, but Akemi squeezed back just as hard. If they were going to die, at least they would die together, not alone. The door swung open and sunlight streamed into the dim barracks. The women blinked against the sudden brightness, their eyes struggling to adjust. Silhouettes appeared in the doorway, American soldiers. But something was wrong. They weren't carrying rifles. They were carrying trays, and on those trays was food. Sergeant Bill Thompson stepped into the barracks first, followed by Private Tommy Chen and several other soldiers. Each of them carried metal trays loaded with cups of steaming coffee, slices of bread, cans of fruit, and even a few chocolate bars. The smell of fresh coffee filled the barracks, a scent that seemed impossibly out of place in this moment of expected death. The women stared in complete disbelief, unable to process what they were seeing. Was this some kind of cruel trick? A final mockery before the execution? Bill Thompson looked at the faces staring back at him, faces filled with terror and confusion, and he felt his throat tighten with emotion. These weren't enemy combatants. They weren't soldiers. They were just women, scared out of their minds, who had been told their entire lives that he and his fellow soldiers were monsters. He cleared his throat and tried to speak, but the words caught. He looked at Tommy Chen, silently asking for help. Tommy stepped forward, and in careful, gentle Japanese, he spoke to the women. His voice was soft, almost apologetic. He told them that the war was over. He told them they were not going to be hurt. He told them that Captain Carter had ordered this breakfast to be prepared for them. as a gesture of peace and humanity. He told them they could eat without fear. And then, his voice breaking slightly, he told them that they were safe now. The women didn't move. They couldn't. The words Tommy spoke contradicted everything they had been taught to believe. Americans showing kindness, offering food instead of violence. It seemed impossible, like a dream or a hallucination brought on by stress and exhaustion. Akemi stared at the young Japanese-American soldier, trying to understand how someone who looked like her could be wearing an American uniform and speaking words of compassion. Nothing made sense anymore. Michiko was the first to move. Perhaps it was because she was older, because she had seen more of life's contradictions and ironies. Perhaps it was because she had nothing left to lose. Or perhaps it was simply because the smell of that coffee was too tempting to resist after months of surviving on rice and water. Slowly, trembling, she stood up and took a hesitant step forward. The American soldiers didn't move to stop her. They simply stood there holding the trays, waiting. Michiko reached out with shaking hands and took a cup of coffee. It was hot, almost too hot to hold, but she clutched it anyway, feeling the warmth seep into her cold fingers. She raised the cup to her lips and took a sip. The taste of real coffee, bitter and strong and perfect, flooded her senses. And then, unexpectedly, tears began to stream down her face. Not tears of fear this time, but tears of relief so overwhelming it felt like her body might break apart from the force of it. She was not going to die. They were not going to die. The monsters were not monsters at all. One by one, the other women began to move. Slowly at first, uncertain, ready to bolt if this turned out to be some elaborate trap. But as they took the cups of coffee, the pieces of bread, the cans of fruit, and nothing bad happened, the reality began to sink in. These American soldiers, these men they had been taught to fear more than death itself, were feeding them, caring for them, treating them like human beings. Akemi accepted a piece of bread from Sergeant Thompson. His hands were rough and scarred from years of combat, but his touch was gentle as he placed the bread in her palm. He smiled at her, a tired, sad smile that somehow conveyed more than words ever could. He was exhausted too. He had suffered too. And yet here he was, choosing kindness when he could have chosen cruelty. Akemi bit into the bread, and the simple taste of it, soft and slightly sweet, brought tears to her eyes, just as it had to Michiko's. Private Chen moved through the barracks, offering food and quiet words of reassurance. Some of the women thanked him in Japanese, their voices barely above a whisper. Others simply nodded, unable to speak through their tears. Chen felt his own eyes burning with unshed tears. His grandmother in California had told him stories about Japan, about honor and duty and sacrifice. But she had also told him about compassion, about the importance of mercy, about how true strength was shown not in violence, but in the choice to be kind, when you had the power to be cruel. Today, he understood what she had meant. Captain Carter stood in the doorway watching his men serve breakfast to the prisoners. He didn't say anything, didn't need to. His presence alone sent a clear message. This was not a rogue act of individual kindness. This was official policy. This was how Americans chose to behave in victory. This was what separated them from the propaganda image that had been painted of them. Carter had seen too much death, too much destruction, too much hatred. If this small act of compassion could plant even the tiniest seed of hope and humanity in the ashes of this terrible war, then it was worth it. As the women ate, the atmosphere in the barracks began to shift. The crushing weight of terror that had pressed down on them all night began to lift, replaced by a fragile, tentative sense of safety. They weren't out of danger entirely. They were still prisoners in a foreign land, still separated from their families, still facing an uncertain future. But they were alive. They had been given food. They had been shown mercy, and that changed everything. Akemi finished her bread and sipped her coffee, savoring every bitter drop. She looked around at the other women, seeing the same mixture of relief and disbelief on every face. They had spent the entire night preparing for death, and instead, they had been given breakfast. It was such a simple thing, food, but in that moment, it represented something far more profound. It represented the possibility that not everything they had been taught was true. It represented the idea that even enemies could choose humanity over hatred. It represented hope. Michiko sat down next to a young woman named Hana, barely 19 years old, who was crying silently as she ate a chocolate bar. Michiko put her arm around the girl's shoulders and held her close, offering the only comfort she could. They had survived. Against all odds, against all expectations, they had survived. And if they could survive this, perhaps they could survive whatever came next. Over the following days and weeks, the dynamic in the camp continued to evolve. The initial shock and disbelief gradually gave way to cautious trust. The American soldiers continued to treat the prisoners with respect and basic human dignity. They provided medical care for those who were ill or injured. They allowed the women to write letters to their families. Though mail service to Japan was still chaotic and unreliable, they even set up a small area where the prisoners could wash clothes and maintain some semblance of personal hygiene and dignity. Sergeant Thompson found himself developing an unexpected rapport with some of the prisoners. Despite the language barrier, with Private Chen's help as translator, he learned bits and pieces about their lives before the war. He learned that Akemi had been a teacher who loved poetry. He learned that Michiko had delivered over 200 babies as a midwife and considered each one a miracle. He learned that these women had dreams, families, hopes, and fears, just like the people back home in Iowa. The realization was both comforting and deeply troubling. If the enemy were just people like him, what did that say about the last 4 years of killing? Captain Carter spent long hours writing reports to his superiors, documenting the condition of the prisoners and requesting guidance on their eventual repatriation. He also spent time talking with his men, helping them process the complex emotions that came with transitioning from warriors to peacekeepers. Some of the soldiers struggled with the shift, unable to reconcile years of combat training with the requirement to now show compassion. Others, like Thompson and Chen, seemed to find purpose in this new role, as if caring for former enemies was a way to reclaim some of the humanity the war had tried to strip away. Private Chen became the unofficial liaison between the guards and prisoners. His ability to speak Japanese fluently made him invaluable, but more than that, his genuine compassion and understanding helped bridge the enormous cultural and psychological divide. Chen spent hours talking with the women, answering their questions about America, about what would happen to them, about whether they would ever see their families again. He couldn't promise them much. The future was still uncertain, but he could promise them that they would be treated fairly and with respect. And after everything they had been through, that promise meant everything. As the weeks passed, stories began to circulate among the prisoners about other camps, other groups of Japanese POWs, who were being treated similarly by their American captors. The narrative that had been drilled into them their entire lives, that Americans were savage monsters without mercy, was crumbling in the face of reality. Some of the women struggled with this cognitive dissonance. If the propaganda about Americans had been lies, what else had they been lied to about? What else about their government, their military, their entire understanding of the war had been false? Akemi wrestled with these questions more than most. As a teacher, she had helped transmit the state's ideology to her students, never questioning its accuracy. She had taught children to revere the emperor as a living god, to view military service as the highest honor, to believe that Japan's cause was righteous and just. Now, sitting in this prison camp, being shown kindness by the very people she had taught her students to hate and fear, she felt the entire foundation of her worldview cracking apart. It was disorienting and frightening, but also, in a strange way, liberating. If everything she had been taught was wrong, then perhaps she could rebuild her understanding of the world on a foundation of truth rather than propaganda. Michiko, with her additional years of life experience, processed these revelations differently. She had always harbored quiet doubts about the war, doubts she never dared voice aloud. She had seen too many young men march off to die for a cause that seemed increasingly desperate and irrational. She had witnessed the suffering of ordinary people, squeezed dry by military demands for resources and labor. The propaganda had always rung hollow to her ears, too simplistic and too absolute. Now, seeing American soldiers behave with decency and compassion, she felt a grim vindication. Governments lied, leaders manipulated, but ordinary people, when given the choice, often chose kindness over cruelty. It was a small comfort, but it was something. The moment when hot coffee and fresh bread replaced expected execution became a defining memory for every woman in that camp. Years later, when they returned to Japan and tried to rebuild their lives in a nation devastated by defeat, They would remember that morning, when they faced the shame and stigma that Japanese society often placed on former prisoners. They would remember the kindness shown to them by their former enemies. When they struggled to reconcile their wartime experiences with their peacetime lives, they would remember that there had been moments of grace even in the darkest times. For Akemi, that morning became a turning point in her life. After repatriation to Japan, she returned to teaching, but with a fundamentally different philosophy. She taught her students about the importance of questioning authority, of seeking truth even when it was uncomfortable, of recognizing the humanity in all people regardless of nationality or ideology. She never forgot the terror of that night, waiting for execution that never came. But more importantly, she never forgot the relief of that dawn, when the monsters turned out to be men who chose mercy. Michiko reunited with her son, who had miraculously survived the war despite being wounded twice. She returned to her work as a midwife, bringing new life into a world that desperately needed renewal and hope. She told every new mother the same thing: raise your children to be kind, raise them to question hatred, raise them to see the humanity in everyone. Because kindness, she had learned, was the most powerful force in the world. It could transform enemies into fellow human beings. It could turn despair into hope. It could save lives. For the American soldiers who served breakfast that morning, the experience was equally transformative. Sergeant Bill Thompson returned to his farm in Iowa, but he was not the same man who had left 4 years earlier. The war had hardened him, scarred him, taught him how to kill, but that morning in the prison camp had reminded him that he could also choose to heal, to help, to show compassion. He married, raised a family, and never spoke much about the war. But on the rare occasions when he did, he always mentioned that morning, the morning when he learned that winning the war was not enough. You also had to win the peace. Private Tommy Chen faced a different kind of challenge upon returning home. His family had been released from the internment camp, but the experience had left deep wounds. They had been betrayed by their own country, imprisoned simply for their ancestry. Tommy's service in the military, his willingness to risk his life for America despite this injustice, was a point of pride, but also of pain. Yet when he thought about his time as a translator in the prison camp, helping bridge the gap between American guards and Japanese prisoners, he felt that perhaps his unique position between two cultures had served a purpose. He had been able to show both sides that the other was human, deserving of respect and compassion. In a small way, he had helped heal wounds that might otherwise have festered for generations. Captain Daniel Carter continued his military career for several more years before retiring and returning to teaching. He taught college-level history, specializing in World War II and its aftermath. His students often asked him about his war experiences, expecting dramatic stories of combat and heroism. Instead, he told them about a morning in a prison camp in the Philippines, when he ordered his men to serve breakfast to terrified women who expected execution. That decision, he told them, was the most important order he ever gave, because it wasn't about military strategy or tactical advantage. It was about what kind of people they chose to be when they had all the power and their enemies had none. That choice, he believed, defined the character of a nation far more than any battlefield victory. The broader historical context of this story reveals an important truth about the Pacific War's end. While there were certainly instances of mistreatment and injustice in the handling of Japanese prisoners by Allied forces, there were also countless examples of compassion, decency, and adherence to international law. American military leadership, for all its flaws, generally insisted on proper treatment of prisoners of war. Medical care was provided. Food was distributed. International Red Cross representatives were allowed access. This stood in stark contrast to the propaganda image that Japanese citizens had been fed throughout the war. The treatment of Japanese POWs by American forces was not uniformly perfect. There were abuses, there were failures, there were moments when anger and revenge took precedence over humanitarian principles. War brings out both the best and worst in humanity, often simultaneously. But on balance, the historical record shows that American forces largely adhered to the Geneva Conventions and treated prisoners with basic human dignity. This was not because Americans were inherently more moral than their enemies, but because they operated within a military culture and legal framework that emphasized rules of war and humanitarian principles. The contrast between propaganda and reality created a profound psychological impact on Japanese prisoners. Many expected torture and execution based on what they had been told by their own government. When they instead received medical treatment, adequate food, and respectful handling, it shattered their worldview. This cognitive dissonance was difficult to process, but it also opened minds to the possibility that they had been systematically deceived by their own leaders. This realization played a role in Japan's post-war transformation, as citizens questioned the ideology that had led them into such a catastrophic conflict. The story of these women and their unexpected breakfast is not unique. Similar scenes played out in camps across the Pacific as the war ended. Japanese soldiers who had been taught to die rather than surrender found themselves taken prisoner and treated humanely. Civilians who had been told that Americans would assault and murder them discovered that Allied forces often went out of their way to provide care and protection. These individual moments of humanity, multiplied across thousands of encounters, helped lay the groundwork for eventual reconciliation between former enemies. The post-war relationship between the United States and Japan became one of the closest alliances in the world, a remarkable transformation given the intense mutual hatred that had characterized the war years. This reconciliation was built on many factors: American occupation policies that focused on rebuilding rather than revenge, Japanese acceptance of democratic reforms, and economic cooperation that benefited both nations. But it also rested on countless individual interactions like that breakfast in the prison camp, moments when people chose compassion over cruelty and humanity over hatred. For the women who lived through that night of terror and that morning of unexpected mercy, the experience became a touchstone for understanding the complexity of human nature. People were not simply good or evil, ally or enemy, monster or hero. They were all of these things and none of these things, capable of both terrible cruelty and profound kindness depending on circumstances and choices. The American soldiers who served them breakfast were not saints. They had killed in combat, had witnessed and participated in the brutality of war. But they had also chosen, in that moment, to be decent human beings, and that choice made all the difference. The breakfast itself, coffee and bread and canned fruit, was unremarkable. Military rations, simple and utilitarian. But in that context, after that night of terror, it became something sacred. It became proof that even after years of propaganda and hatred, even after countless deaths and unimaginable destruction, human beings could still choose to see each other as human. That morning, in a small prison camp on a remote Philippine island, a group of American soldiers and Japanese prisoners shared a meal and, in doing so, took a small step toward healing the wounds of war. The story of when the monsters arrived and brought breakfast instead of bullets is ultimately a story about the resilience of human decency. War tries to destroy that decency, tries to reduce people to categories of friend and enemy, tries to make killing and hatred seem normal and necessary. But decency persists. It survives in the spaces between propaganda and reality, in the moments when people choose compassion despite having every reason to choose cruelty. Those moments don't erase the horror of war, don't justify the suffering or redeem the deaths, but they do remind us that even in humanity's darkest hours, light can still break through. For Akemi Nakamura, Michiko Sato, and all the women who survived that night and that morning, the memory became both a burden and a gift. A burden because it forced them to confront how thoroughly they had been deceived by their own government. A gift because it proved that mercy and compassion could exist even in the most unlikely circumstances. They carried that memory with them for the rest of their lives, a reminder that the world was more complex, more nuanced, and ultimately more hopeful than propaganda would have them believe. The American soldiers who served that breakfast also carried the memory forward. For men who had spent years learning to dehumanize and kill the enemy, the act of providing care and comfort represented a reclaiming of their own humanity. They had been forced by war to do terrible things, things that haunted many of them for decades. But they had also done something beautiful. They had shown mercy when they could have shown cruelty. They had chosen to feed rather than to harm. And in that choice, they had demonstrated that the war had not completely destroyed their capacity for goodness. Captain Daniel Carter's decision to order that breakfast was not a grand strategic move or a historically significant policy change. It was simply one man in one place at one moment choosing to do the right thing. But the ripple effects of that choice extended far beyond that morning. The women who received that kindness went on to rebuild their lives and teach their children about the complexity of human nature. The soldiers who provided it went home with a memory that reminded them they were more than warriors. They were human beings capable of compassion. And the story, passed down through families and eventually documented by historians, became a small but meaningful part of the narrative of how former enemies became friends. This is why that morning matters. Not because it was unique. There were many similar moments throughout the post-war period. Not because it erased the horrors of the war, nothing could do that, but because it demonstrated that even after years of systematic dehumanization, even after propaganda had poisoned minds and hearts, even after so much death and suffering, people could still choose to see each other as human beings. That choice, repeated over and over in countless individual interactions, made reconciliation possible. It allowed former enemies to become allies. It created space for healing and growth. The women of that prison camp, expecting execution but receiving breakfast, learned in the most visceral way possible that propaganda lies. The American soldiers, trained to see the Japanese as fanatical enemies, learned that the people they had been fighting were human beings with families, dreams, and fears, just like their own. Both groups were changed by that encounter. The fear and hatred that had been carefully cultivated by years of war propaganda couldn't survive the simple human interaction of sharing a meal. This story is a reminder that at its core, war is a failure of imagination. It's a failure to imagine that the people on the other side of the conflict are fundamentally like us. It's a failure to imagine solutions that don't require killing. It's a failure to imagine a world where differences can be resolved without violence. But it's also a reminder that even when war comes, even when that failure of imagination has already occurred and the killing has begun, individual acts of imagination and compassion can still make a difference. They can still plant seeds of peace in the scorched earth of conflict. The morning when breakfast replaced bullets was one such act of imagination. Captain Carter imagined what it would be like to be in the prisoner's place, terrified and expecting death. Sergeant Thompson imagined what those women's families must be feeling, not knowing if their loved ones were alive or dead. Private Chen imagined a world where his Japanese heritage and his American citizenship didn't have to be in conflict, where both parts of his identity could be honored. And the prisoners, when they accepted the food being offered, imagined that perhaps everything they had been taught about their enemies was wrong. That collective act of imagination, of seeing beyond propaganda to shared humanity, was what made that morning transformative. In the decades since World War II ended, the relationship between the United States and Japan has been studied extensively by historians, political scientists, and sociologists. Scholars have analyzed occupation policies, economic factors, political reforms, and cultural exchanges. All of these played important roles in transforming bitter enemies into close allies. But underlying all the policy decisions and strategic calculations were countless individual human interactions, like the one in that prison camp. Moments when people chose compassion over cruelty, understanding over hatred, hope over despair. These moments, multiplied across millions of interactions over years and decades, created the foundation for lasting peace. The story of the women who expected execution but received breakfast is ultimately a story about hope. Not naive hope that ignores the reality of human cruelty and the horrors of war, but a more mature hope, grounded in the recognition that even after terrible conflict, even after systematic dehumanization, even after years of killing and dying, people can still choose to be decent to one another. That choice is always available, even in the darkest circumstances. And when people make that choice, when they extend compassion to those they have been taught to hate, they open up possibilities for healing and reconciliation that propaganda insists are impossible. So if you found this story moving, if it made you think about the power of small acts of kindness in times of great darkness, then make sure to subscribe to our channel. Hit that like button and leave a comment below sharing your thoughts on this incredible moment in history. What would you have done in that situation? How do you think we can apply these lessons about compassion and humanity to conflicts in our own time? Your perspective matters, and we want to hear it. Thanks for watching, and remember, even in our darkest moments, we always have the choice to extend mercy rather than cruelty. That choice is what makes us human.